الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. All praise due to Allah, and may Allah's peace and blessings be on the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and on all those who follow the path of righteousness until the last day. In this, the third session in which we're looking at the study questions, which we're calling them study questions. Basically, they're a review of what we have covered in the second half of the term. And we're going from chapter 10, section 10 of the book, called Differences Among the Ummah. Question 31. What was the most outstanding act and position, I guess a legal position really, of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's followers, which led the Muslim world to declare them apostate innovators?
That was when he wanted to lower the grave of Umar bin Khattab's brother, I think, Zayd bin Khattab, because they had a monument or whatever.
Okay, the most outstanding act was the leveling of the graves in both Mecca and Medina. For Aisha, for all the other Sahabiyat and Sahaba who had huge mausoleums built over their graves, right? They leveled all of that. So that was the outstanding act. That is the glaring act. It's not to say that was the only act. There were other acts also. In terms of the position, what position did they hold? Now this has to do with now a theological position, a creedal position, which put them in this category of apostate innovators. With regards to the creed, well, the position was concerning tawassul. That is intermediacy. They took the position that in this life, no intermediacy was accessible through individuals who had already passed away. But of course, tawassul through somebody who's living, nobody denies that. That's well known and acceptable. Tawassul using one's deeds, one's good deeds. This is mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's there. People who had been locked in the cave, stone had fallen over the cave. They ask Allah to remove the stone based on certain righteous acts that they did. So we know that that is also acceptable. The intermediacy of the Prophet ﷺ on the Day of Judgment, this is real. But in this life, while we are living and he is dead, there's nothing that he can do for anybody. Nor can any other of the so-called saints, righteous individuals, etc. of the past, who are dead and gone. None of them can do anything. So this is the position that they took. And that, because this practice of tawassul, calling on the saints and the righteous, was so widespread in the Muslim world, when they took this position and promoted it, it seemed like innovation. How the true religion, according to its fundamentals, can become innovation, in a time where the norm is innovation. In the time when the norm is innovation, then the true way appears to be innovation. Second question, how do those who insist on taqleed reconcile the known differences and contradictions among the madhabs? How do they reconcile it? Those who insist on taqleed, of course, they're saying that all of the madhabs, they're all authentic. Right? There's nothing wrong with any of them. So how then do they reconcile the differences, the errors, what appears to be contradictions? We don't call it errors because they looked at the madhabs as being infallible. So there weren't any errors in that regard, right? So then what was their position in that regard? Well, what they did was they promoted certain hadiths which glorify and celebrate differences. So the hadith ikhtilaf ummati rahma, the differences among my nation is a mercy, led them to promote the idea that these differences is a mercy for the ummah. It is acceptable, and in fact it was a mercy from Allah. So they didn't in any way challenge these differences or contradictions. They reinforced them and approved them. The third question, question 33, discuss the status of the various hadiths which justify and glorify the value of differences. Like the one I previously mentioned, the disagreement among my nation is a mercy. Differences among my Sahaba are mercy to you. My Sahaba are like stars. You'll be guided by whichever of them you follow. All of them are hadiths carrying the same meaning. So in terms of the hadiths, the differences among my ummah is a mercy. That is not merely a weak hadith, it is fabricated. It has no chain of narration found in any of the books of hadith. So you can't really even call it a hadith. It's a fabrication. As to the other hadiths, my companions are like stars, or differences amongst my companions is a mercy. These can be found in books of hadith, but they're inauthentic. They're extremely weak. And in fact, they are themselves considered, some of the different narrations of them are also considered to be fabricated. Though they're even found, they do have chains of narrations, are found in books, but they are listed amongst the fabricated hadiths. So when that question asked to discuss the status of these hadiths, one would also, in answering it, need to mention that not only are they inauthentic as a group, but they also go against the clear text of the Qur'an. They're in clear opposition to the text of the Qur'an, which call division, splitting up, and contradiction a curse, something which was evil. Allah said, وَلَا تَكُونُوا مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ مِنَ الَّذِينَ فَرَّقُوا دِينَهُمْ وَكَانُوا شِيَعًا. Do not be like those among the idolaters who split up their religion into sects. Right? So when you have a hadith, Quranic text like that, and you have a hadith which says splitting up into sects is wonderful, be happy, and we say, hey, there's something wrong here. The text of the Sunnah should not contradict absolutely the text of the Quran. If there are some elements that the Sunnah adds to the meaning of the Quranic verse, or the Quran complements some element of a hadith, then this is acceptable. But clear and open contradiction, black and white type differences, not acceptable. The hadith would then be considered not authentic. Question 34, compare and contrast the statements attributed to the Prophet ﷺ regarding following his companions and that of Imam Malik in regards to following one of them. Statements attributed to the Prophet ﷺ about following his companions. On one hand, you have statements like what you mentioned before, where the Prophet ﷺ said, was supposed to have said, My companions are like stars. Any of them you follow will be rightly guided. That's one batch. But then there are hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ said, follow my sunnah and the sunnah of the righteous caliphs after me. Or when he said that people are going to split up into different sects, and only one sect is going to paradise. When he was asked which sect is that, he said the one that I am on and you are on. So this element of sects being supported, or we won't call it sex means word. We call it no. The fact that the following of the companions was considered to be something commendable by the Prophet ﷺ in this regard. So those are authentic. And then we have the statement of Imam Malik in this regard. What did Imam Malik say? He said that Malik was once asked whether one of you was safe to follow a ruling related to him by reliable narrators who heard it from the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. He replied, no, by Allah, not unless it is correct. The truth is only one. Can two opposing opinions be simultaneously correct? The opinion which is correct can only be one. Right? So we had that. People say there's leeway in the differences among the Sahaba. But this is not so. It was a case of right and wrong rulings. So what do you do? What do you do with a situation like that? We have some hadiths which say that following any of the companions you'll be rightly guided. We said those are weak. So we analyze that because we're saying compare and contrast. So that statement we said was weak, fabricated. We can't really use it for evidence. But now what do we do? Well, we do have some evidence where the Prophet ﷺ does pray his sunnah and the sunnah of the righteous caliphs after him. And he also talked about the way he was on, the way the companions were on, as being the right way. So we have those, and then we have the statement of Imam Malik. What do we do with the statement of Imam Malik, in which he said, what do we do with the statement of Imam Malik in which he said that following one of the companions alone is not enough, because whatever they stated or whatever they ruled could have been right or wrong. So to follow them in everything that they ruled is error. So how do we put that in the context of the praise of following the way of the companions? How do we sum that up?
They were human, they made mistakes, and sometimes one could be correct and the other one could be wrong.
Well, that's what it states. So therefore, to say, as the Prophet ﷺ said, what I am on and what you're on, when he was asked what is the right way, he said what I'm on and what you're on. But if they're in error, what is that saying? Collectively. Now this is the point that needed to be mentioned here. It is their collective position. Because even the Khulafa Rashidin, when he said, follow my sunnah and the sunnah of the Khulafa Rashidin, there are issues on which they were in error. They were human beings and they made errors. So we're not obliged to follow whatever they do. We're only obliged to follow what is known to be correct, what they agreed upon, what they all agreed upon, like ijma. Then that's what we are required to follow. That is the way that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about. Their collective way, not necessarily individual way, because as individuals, they can be in error. Okay, question 35. Identify the position of the Qur'an with regards to differences and conflict among the believers, and support your conclusion with at least 2 examples. We sort of touched on that already. The position of the Qur'an with regards to differences and conflict among the believers. What's the position of the Qur'an?
Allah SWT warns against splitting the ummah.
Yeah. The Qur'an calls to unification, unity. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا. Hold on firmly to the rope of Allah together. So it is opposed to differences. So then, okay, that was one example. It's a matter of just finding another verse as a further support. Yeah, that's the other example. كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Don't be among the disbelievers or the mushrikeen, that's the idol worshippers, those who split up their religion into sects, each one happy with what they followed. 36. Respond with at least 3 evidences to a person who claimed that it is okay to follow an imam blindly in all his rulings, because the Prophet ﷺ said, if a judge strives his utmost and makes a correct ruling, he receives 2 rewards, and if he errs, he receives 1 reward.
It is shirk ibadiyah, to follow blindly.
Ittiba. Shirk al-ittiba. We talked about shirk fi tawheed al-ittiba, that is, a form of partnership in the exclusive right to be followed, which is the right of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ alone. But that's not a response. We're talking about a response with 3 evidences to a person who claimed that it is okay to follow an imam blindly in all his rulings, because the Prophet ﷺ said, if a judge strives his utmost and makes a correct ruling, he receives 2 rewards, and if he errs, he will receive 1. See, that is the person, the blind follower, who is justifying his position. He says, I'm following a scholar about whom the Prophet ﷺ said, even if he's wrong, he gets a reward. Well, the point is, if you know that he is wrong, will you get a reward following him knowing that he's wrong? No. So you and him are different. He is rewarded because he has made his ijtihad, and that's what he came to. Did you make ijtihad? No, you didn't. So that hadith is not applicable to you. There's no reward in following him in what is wrong if you know that he is wrong. Nor do you get any reward in following what is right, if you really don't know that he is right. You're just following blindly, regardless, right, wrong, I don't care, I'm following. So the evidences that you would use here, would be the statement of Imam Malik, right, that it's an issue of right and wrong, and that one would not be, if you're not going to be safe following a Sahabi in this regard, then surely the Imams, you're definitely not going to be safe in following them. 37. Compare and contrast differences among the Sahaba with differences among blind followers of the madhabs. Because those who have differences among the blind followers of the madhabs, they can say, well, we are like the Sahaba. They had differences among them. So what is the problem? Why are you making an issue about differences among us?
The differences in the Sahaba didn't split them, they didn't have a conflict between them. And often when the Prophet ﷺ was there, they would turn to the Prophet ﷺ to get them enlightenment from it. But now the difference that it is now, it's splitting the Ummah and causing conflict.
Yeah, we can say that the consequence of the differences among the Sahaba, where people refused to pray behind each other, this didn't happen. Whereas this happened with the differences among the blind followers, right? Because their differences were not over knowledge. It was about fanatical following. They were fanatically following one scholar or another. So because of the fact that the differences came from a different source, then the consequences were different, and as such, they cannot be compared. One cannot say this is like that. Question 38, explain how the difference of opinion between madhabs concerning the answer to the question, are you a believer, led to excommunication, and discuss its origin.
One group said we are a believer, inshallah. And I think the Hanafis were against. They said, no, you cannot say inshallah. So that caused a difference between them. That you have to say, yes, I am a believer, absolutely, not inshallah.
But yeah, the question is asking you how the difference of opinion led to excommunication. So you have to be careful when you're answering this. I mean, what you said is true, but that's not the answer to this question. You have to, when you read a question, try to look at what is the question actually asking. Not, what do you know about this? Because basically that's your answer. Your answer was, what do you know about the difference of opinion concerning the question, are you a believer? That was the answer you gave to that question. But this question is, how? This is asking how, not what do you know, but how did the difference concerning the answer to the question, are you a believer, lead to excommunication? The answer from the woman's side was that the answer, I'm a believer inshallah, those who held that answer, according to the other side, that was an expression of doubt. Doubt about one's faith, which means doubt about whether you believe in God or not. So if you have doubt about belief in God, whether there is a God or not, then that's the same as not believing in God. So doubt about faith is equivalent to a lack of faith. So that's where the issue of declaring that person who has doubt now a disbeliever. So that's where you have excommunication. Now, the origin, where did this come from? No. Yeah, where did this originate? Where did this whole issue of I'm a believer, are you a believer, where did this whole issue come up? Where did it start from? Well, it started from Abu Hanifa's unique position, right? That Iman neither decreased nor increased. That's where it started from. Abu Hanifa, amongst all of the other scholars, took the position that Iman neither increases nor decreases. Means either you have Iman or you don't have it. So that position, later on we talked about it, this ends up becoming one of the pillars of the Murji'ah, right? One particular philosophical Islamic sect. Everybody else held that Iman increased and decreased. So this idea of Iman not decreasing or increasing, meant that one cannot, one either is a believer or a disbeliever. So if somebody asks you, are you a believer? You cannot say anything which implies your belief is not quite, it's growing or it's whatever, you gotta have it. Yes, you have to say with certainty, I am a believer, based on that premise. But this other issue of are you a believer, inshallah, this was not spoken about by Abu Hanifa. See, that's what was built on his statement. And on top of that, conclusion was built later on the issue of you can't marry those who have doubt in their faith. So you see, each stage, was building on the other. But that wasn't what the founder said. That was not his position. That's where they ended up. Because they were not going back to the sources that he took it from. They were building upon the ruling which he made. And that's what Abu Hanifa had said himself. Don't make rulings according to my rulings unless you know where I got my rulings from. That is essential. Okay. Question, identify the two categories, question 39, into which differing rulings fall with examples and discuss how they are to be treated. What are the two categories in which differing rulings fall? And? Yeah, either contradictory differences or variational differences. Okay, what does that mean? What is a contradictory difference? Okay, the positions which cannot be held simultaneously. For example, okay, one is either in a state of wudu or not in a state of wudu. So therefore, if we have a ruling which says, if you do this, you have wudu, another madhab says, if you do this, you don't have wudu. These two cannot coexist. Either you have wudu or you don't have wudu. Okay, variational differences. Give an example of a variational difference. Okay, raising the hands at the beginning of prayer, for example, not whether you do or you don't, but how you do or you don't. How do you do? Sorry. You raise your hands either to the level of your ears, or you raise your hands either to the level of your shoulders. Both of these are narrated. So these are referred to as variational differences. They can coexist. Of course, you can't do both at the same time, but it is permissible for you to do one or the other. You could do one or you could do the other. So they represent a variation, meaning you have choices in the matter. Question 40. Suggest how differences arising from word meanings, the absence of hadith, or the use of weak hadith may be resolved using examples of each. Okay, let's do word meanings first. How can a difference in word meanings be resolved? First, give me an example or explain to me how you can have differences regarding word meanings.
The issue of touching the wife. That word, I think the word lamsta or something.
Lamastum.
I think it means there's a variation in the meaning to either touch or to hold, something like this.
Okay, I mean, it's something along that line. What it's talking about is where words may have a literal or a metaphorical meaning. So touching, for example, and when I say, I'm just saying, if I say, for example, I see what you say, right? Somebody, you made it. Do you see what I mean? Right? Can you see a meaning? No, you can't. Can you see a saying? No, unless it's written out, right? Right? So these are metaphorical usage of the word see. But if I say, I can see you, I can see your book, this is the literal meaning. So where you have a word like see, which has both metaphorical and literal usages, then it is possible in a given circumstance for people to take different meanings from it, different understandings from it. And the example you gave of lamastum in the Qur'an, which means to touch, from lams, it could mean to touch or to have sexual relations. So these are two possible meanings. So those scholars who took one ended up with one ruling with regards to touching women. Those scholars who took another ended up with a different ruling with regards to touching women. So how do we resolve a difference like that? Go back to the hadith, meaning go back to the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What did he do? What does his sunnah tell us? We can only deduce what is meant by that Quranic text by seeing his practice, because he was the one who lived the Quran. So when we find narrations, authentic narrations, that he kissed his wives and went and led salah, then it clarified that la mastum here refers to sexual relations and not physical touching. Okay, where we had differences as a result of the absence of hadiths, how do you resolve those differences? No, when you talk about differences in which there's an absence of hadith, it means where some scholars had the hadith and other scholars didn't. So in that case, you resolve those differences by following the rulings of the scholars who had the hadiths. They have to be given precedence over those who didn't have the hadiths. Right? The one with the evidence is given precedence with the one without the evidence. The third category, where they use weak hadiths. Again, you will say the one who used a weak hadith, for example, Imam Shafi'i took a weak hadith for qunut in Fajr. That it should be done in every Fajr prayer you do dua al-qunut. But this hadith is weak. So where the scholar or the madhab has taken a position based on a weak hadith, then you have to reject that ruling. Right? There may not be a sahih hadith saying the opposite. Because the point is that salah, as a general principle, salah doesn't have qunut. Because somebody may say, okay, what's your evidence? Where's the hadith where it says the Prophet ﷺ did not make qunut in Salat al-Fajr? We have a weak hadith. Okay, we said ours is weak. But where's your hadith which said he didn't? You see? Though the response to this is the fiqh principle, usul fiqh principle, that producing evidence is on the claimant. Right? You're the one claiming that there is qunut in Fajr. So you're the one who has to produce the evidence. I don't have to produce evidence that there is none. Because the normal or the standard situation is that there is none. All of the other prayers don't have it. The Prophet ﷺ taught us to pray, he didn't mention it. So therefore, the normal situation is not to have qunut. Therefore, anyone who claims that there is qunut, he is the one who has to bring the evidence. And if his evidence is not authentic, we say it's enough for us to say, your evidence is not authentic, we don't do it, it's rejected. Discuss how differences resulting from qiyas may be reconciled. We have a ruling, we have an issue that needs a ruling. Now one scholar takes one hadith and he makes qiyas, analogy, and comes to a ruling for this. Another scholar takes a different hadith and comes to another ruling for this circumstance. Or two scholars take the same hadith, but they come to different conclusions, by analogy for their ruling. Well, how do we resolve this? How do we determine, resolving meaning what? Which ruling is correct? How do we determine which ruling in fact is correct. Well, reality is that qiyas is reasoning, deductive reasoning. Scholars differed in their abilities to make that reasoning. Their students differed in their understandings. So when you're dealing with something like this, as long as the scholar is using a sound source, he's basing it on an authentic hadith, verses from the Qur'an, what we can say is that the one who makes the analogy, who has the most evidence, his would be the stronger of the two or the three. Meaning, one has Qur'an, Sunnah, Ijma', which he makes his deduction and comes to a ruling. Another has only Qur'an and Sunnah, but he doesn't have Ijma' of the Sahaba to make his ruling. The third only has Qur'an, he's not even using Hadith. Or one is using Hadith, not using Qur'an. Right? So we have different analogical deductions coming out. You have four possibilities here. Right? So what we say is that the one which has the most support, then that is the one we give the precedence to. Now what if they all had the same support? No, if they're all authentic, then we have a variation to choose from. Which one is most applicable in our circumstance? Right? This is now we go to the maslaha. Right? Here is your istihsan, here is your istishab, all your principles, you're applying it here now. You know, what is most suitable for this circumstance? Okay, now, if rulings are equally supported by Quran, Sunnah, and Ijma', how would we treat them? No, we take them as options. Again, what is most applicable? What is most suitable to our circumstance? Briefly describe the type of religious learning institutions necessary for a revival of the original way, meaning the way of the Salaf, the way of the early generation, with regard to the study of madhabs and primary sources of Islamic law. What type of religious institution? How does that religious institution how does it have to function with regards to the madhabs? How are we going to study madhabs in this religious institution? Do we have to get rid of them? We don't study them. The religious institution should just be dealing with Quran and Sunnah. It ignores the study, it does not get into the study of madhabs, because the study of madhabs reinforces the division. Is that the way? No. Why not?
We should learn about them and know the differences and why they take the good from them and why they're opposed to the conflict.
Because the prophets also said that the last generations of the Sahabas and the Tabi'in, so they probably excel most in Islam. So we have to take them out there.
Okay. The argument here is that the Prophet ﷺ praised the first three generations, meaning that praised them and the decisions and the positions that they held. So for us to just say, forget it, we're only going to go back to Quran and Sunnah, is to ignore what the Prophet ﷺ praised. So therefore, that principle of the leading righteous scholars, following their rulings, learning from them, benefiting from them, this is something which is required in the institution. But in such an institution, one would study the rulings of the madhabs based on the original rulings, right? Where they're based on solid evidence and not just rulings based on rulings based on rulings, right? So we would look at them equally and determine which ones were most appropriate given the evidences which they used, the conclusions which they arrived at. Okay, in terms of the primary sources of Islamic law, that institution should train the students to go back to the primary sources so that they could analyze the different information coming from the various madhabs and the early scholars. Okay, so that covers basically our evolution of fiqh text. We're now going on to the Chennai treatise. Yes, we did this as a case study of what happens when a person rejects the way of the believers, the way of the early generation of righteous scholars, etc. Their understanding, one who rejects that. And the individual that we used, this individual P.J. Zainul Abidin from South India, from Chennai, who took the position that once one pays zakah on wealth, then zakah need not be paid a second time on that same wealth. This was his position, right? So we're looking at how did he arrive at it, why is it wrong, how do we refute it? You know, and this is, so it's only a case study, meaning that this type of thing will repeat itself. And we're looking at the methodology here. How do we deal with such a circumstance? Not necessarily P.J. Zainul Abidin himself as a person and his particular ruling, but the principle is what we're trying to extract from it. So from this treatise, explain how to respond to a person who states that the celebration of the Prophet's birthday is mentioned in verse 56 of Surah Al-Ahzab. Somebody says, it is mentioned in the Qur'an, Allah instructs us to celebrate the birthday of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How do we respond? How do we explain to this person that what you're saying is not correct? Okay, first question to him is, how, rather than going to how did they understand, because that's what you're trying to show him eventually, that the way he understood is not how they did. So the first question is, did the Prophet and his companions understand the verse in the way you do? That's the first question. They're claiming this verse is an instruction to the Prophet ﷺ and his companions to celebrate his birthday. So we ask him, did the Prophet and the companions understand it that way? So he has only two possible answers, right? Either yes, they did, or no, they didn't. Okay? So, if yes, they did, that's the first one, then the question is, why didn't they do what you're doing? Right? Because they obviously didn't. They didn't do it. They didn't celebrate it the way you're doing it. So you have to now backtrack, and he says, well, no, they didn't. That's why they didn't. No, they didn't. So the question is, do you know better than the Prophet and his companions? Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? Because for you to be understanding what they didn't understand, it means that you have understood this verse, better than they understood it. Which is heretical to make that kind of a claim. So this is how you bring that person to logically understand that that interpretation must be false. Okay, question 45. Discuss the ruling on praying the sunnah prayer of wudu. We have a sunnah of wudu. Whose sunnah was it?
Bilal.
Sunnah of Bilal, right? Which the Prophet ﷺ affirmed and became sunnah in general. Praying the sunnah of wudu in jama'ah, right? What is the ruling concerning praying the sunnah of wudu in jama'ah? Permissible or impermissible? Huh? Not permissible. Okay, then it says using evidence for and against. What is the evidence? What evidence could be brought to support praying the sunnah of wudu in jama'ah? Okay, Prophet ﷺ said that praying in jama'ah is worth 25 to 27 times more than praying by yourself. That's one evidence. Right? That's 4. Is there, you have another evidence 4? Huh? No, to pray it in jama'ah. No, this is not, because we're dealing with a sunnah prayer. That man was praying a fard prayer, right? So we can't use the hadith of tasadduq. No. You bring an example of salatul jama'ah for sunnah. Taraweeh. We have Taraweeh, which is a sunnah prayer done in jama'ah. We have the recommendation of the Prophet ﷺ. We have the practice. Okay. Now what is the evidence against that? The fact that the Sahaba, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the Sahaba didn't do it in jama'ah. That is our evidence.
Another one would be that if we were to do the sunnah of wudu in jama'ah, then we could do. Then we should also do the.
Yeah, because once you say sunnah wudu, you're saying everything. Any sunnah can be done in jama'ah. So so our evidence is that the Prophet ﷺ and the companions didn't do it. Now, this other person argues, but the Prophet ﷺ recommended it. Yeah. Did he do everything he recommended? Are there some things which the Prophet ﷺ recommended which he himself didn't do? Or he permitted, but he himself didn't do it? Well, we don't know. Yeah, Ibn Umar did. But we cannot say, because Ibn Umar did, and we have no evidence to say that the Prophet ﷺ did or didn't, we can't say he didn't.
But no, there is hadith that said that the Prophet ﷺ did not touch his beard at all from the top, from the bottom of any.
No. Well, bring that one, but I don't believe so. Yeah, the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat desert lizard, the dab, but he permitted others to do it. Not everything the Prophet ﷺ permitted, and he himself did. So if we have that gray area of things which he didn't do, but which he permitted, and we have this recommendation, the way out of this is that these things, when we talk about eating dab, is this ibadah? Yeah, that is the difference. Because Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he said that he left nothing which would bring you closer to Allah, this is ibadah, without telling you to do it. So if he didn't tell us to do it, either verbally or by his actions, then it is not going to bring us closer to Allah. This is how we respond. Yeah, okay, we have also this principle, which is deduced from this, as well as the hadith about whoever innovates in our religion, something which is not of it is not accepted. That the basic ruling or the basic state for religious practices is that they're all forbidden except those which have been specifically permitted. Whereas for mu'amalat, or actions which are from our social day-to-day business type needs, which have nothing to do with ibadah purely, although everything can become ibadah anyway, then the basic state of such things, the ruling regarding such things, is that they're all permissible unless a specific text comes to prohibit it. So since the issue of Salatul Wudu, Sunnah of Wudu, this is a ibadah. So we would only do it if Prophet Muhammad ﷺ either said do it or if he himself did it. Or if the Sahaba did it, were known to have done it, indicating that he probably instructed them to do it. We would assume that. Okay? 46. Compare the claim that payment of zakah is required only once on a single portion of wealth with the claim that fasting is only required once in a lifetime. Right. Virtually, these statements are equal. To claim that you only pay zakah once is like saying you only fast once. Because the instruction, basic instruction is pay zakah, fast Ramadan. So if you fast Ramadan, you've fulfilled the command of fasting Ramadan. The Qur'an doesn't say fast every Ramadan. The Hadith doesn't say fast every Ramadan. Right? It's in general, whoever fasts Ramadan. So these statements become equal. So the point is that one who makes a claim that payment of zakah is only once is like one who makes the claim that fasting is required only once. So what would be our ruling on a person who says you only have to fast one Ramadan in your life and that's it? We'd say this man is a deviant, he's a heretic, he's left Islam. So similar statement applies to the one who claims that about zakah. Why? Why are we going to do that? Didn't scholars make mistakes? Right? Actually, it's a later last question. It says, is PJ's claim considered a mere mistake of scholars or is it considered heresy? Why are we going to make his statement heresy and we have scholars, big scholars making statements which could also be errors and we don't call them heresy? Okay, the first argument is that this individual PJ is not a scholar. He has not learned. So his learning doesn't put him in that position of a scholar who makes a mistake and gets his reward. He is ignorant. He does not have sufficient knowledge, fundamentally. So that's one point which puts him outside of that category. Secondly,
he rejected the positions of the scholars of the past, as well as the practice of the Sahaba. By doing that, basically saying that he has understood Islam better than them. And it's outright against all of them. No scholar in the past or anybody on that position. Even the Sahaba, no Sahabi.
okay, second point, that he is taking a position which is against the Ummah. He's the only one of the ummah taking this position, rejecting the scholarship and the knowledge and the closeness to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, everything of all of that. He's rejecting all of that and saying, I know better than everybody else. That is not just a mistake, that is challenging the ummah. It's revolt against the ummah. Also, the scholars are unanimous that if a person denies something which is known of the religion by necessity, then that is enough to put that person in a state of disbelief, to excommunicate him. Knowing that you fast every Ramadan, this is known by necessity. The whole Muslim world does it. Although you have individuals who don't do it, negligent or disobedient, sinful, whatever, but it is known that this is a requirement. It's not something obscure like, is hell forever? Is Dajjal coming? These are, though there are hadiths and everything which clarify and so on, so still, the average Muslim may not have this knowledge. So a person may, in ignorance, make statements like, no, it's not Dajjal. But this is stories, fairy tales, folklore, So this kind of statements don't take a person out of the religion because it's not something which is known by necessity. Okay, discuss PJ's ruling on the hadith. Whenever you possess 200 dirhams and a year passes on it, 5 dirhams is to be paid on it. What was his position on this hadith?
25%.
No.
25%, sorry.
No. We're asking, what is PJ's ruling on this hadith? His ruling is that the hadith was daif. He mentions that the chains of narration, are daif. Right? Now, what is the fact? Is it true? The chains of narration of the hadith are daif. Is it daif? No, it is. 3 out of 10. That's the point. 3 out of 10 chains are in fact daif. But there are 7 other chains which are authentic. So that hadith, while he's raising the banner, the hadith is daif, and he's quoting hadith scholars who say this hadith is daif, it's daif from that set of narrators. But the overall ruling on the hadith is that it is sahih. That is so his claim, his ruling is a false ruling, while quoting from classical texts which are in fact saying the hadith is daif. You see, this is something which for the average person would be confusing. The common person, how? He is quoting from the leading scholars of hadith, saying that this hadith is daif, and you're coming along and saying it's sahih. Do you know more than these leading scholars of hadith? You see, it can be brought back to you like this, right? So something like this, you really have to have your material together. Show him that, okay, he's quoted from this scholar who says this is daif. Here is another set of scholars who say this is sahih. So how can it be daif and sahih at the same time? How can that be? So for the common person, you're going to have to clarify for him that hadiths were narrated by chains of narrators. Sometimes those chains are weak, sometimes those chains are strong. If all of the chains of a hadith are all weak, then we say this hadith is weak in its totality. This is daif, no doubt, no ifs, ands, and buts. But if it is weak in some chains and strong in some chains, then the strongest chains take precedence over the weak chains. So we can only say it is weak from this perspective, but in fact the hadith is strong. And this is a science. We'd have to explain to people. This is a science. It's not something that I say, he says, different people say. There is a science here. Well, those weak chains that he called weak, they are really Hasan li ghayrihi. Right? Assuming that the weakness in the chain was due to weakness of memory. But if it was due to the fact that the narrator was a fabricator, then we don't elevate that hadith. We don't elevate it to the level of Hasan li ghayrihi, or Hasan, or acceptable, workable, based on other narrations. Okay, second argument of PJ, that zakah is purification of wealth, and once done, it no longer needs further purification. How do you refute that argument?
He's misinterpreted the verse.
He's misinterpreted the verse. What is the verse? Okay, so what does that verse mean? Take from their
Wealth, charity,
sadaqah, this is really zakah.
purify them.
Zakiyams to sanctify them, to purify and sanctify them with it. Right? So it is the purification mentioned in the verse is not of the wealth, but of the people. It's to purify them, not to say to purify their wealth. So he has snuck in another meaning, and a person not really familiar, he quotes the verse, and person not really familiar with the Arabic understanding what's going on here, it sounds like what he's saying is correct. He can even tell you that, to tahiruhum, to purify them. Them here, them here refers back to their wealth, because Arabic plurals, it could say anything. People not knowing Arabic can hear, and you think this person knows what he's talking about, but in fact he's talking nonsense. Right? So what then does purification in the verse mean? Yeah, it's to purify them of greed, right, with regards to their wealth, whatever evil characteristics they may have. How should one respond to those who seek, question number 50, to make a distinction between newly acquired wealth and previously owned wealth vis-a-vis zakah payment from the perspective of evidence? 50. Somebody who seeks to make a distinction between newly acquired wealth and previously owned wealth vis-a-vis zakah payment from the perspective of evidence. Okay, from the perspective of evidence, is there any distinction made between newly acquired wealth and previously owned wealth? No. That's the point. The evidence just talks about giving zakah on wealth. It doesn't make a distinction between newly acquired and previously owned. So therefore, again, we say, your claim that it is only on newly acquired requires evidence. Where is your evidence? He doesn't have any. Question 51. Briefly discuss how the hadith of Al-Abbas on payment of zakah, on advance payment of zakah, refutes PJ's claim that zakah is only required on newly acquired wealth, on which zakah has not already been paid. How? Al-Abbas was given permission by the Prophet ﷺ in an authentic hadith to pay zakah in advance. How does that permission of the Prophet ﷺ refute PJ's argument that you only need to pay zakah on wealth on which you haven't already paid zakah?
That's 2 years.
Yeah, you've paid 2 years of zakah, so what?
That's not only once. PJ's argument is once you paid on that wealth, you paid less, paid for the next the coming year.
Okay, What the advance payment means, you've paid zakat twice on the same wealth. He's saying you only pay once. So that is itself proof that it is from the sunnah to do so. 52. Explain the significance of Umar ibn al-Khattab's statement, trade with the orphan's wealth so that zakat will not consume it. How is this significant in refuting PJ's claims? Trade, do business.
Because consume it would have to take every year.
Right.
More than once.
Right. The fact that he said, otherwise zakah will consume it, it means that if you didn't trade with his wealth, you didn't do business to earn more on it, means zakah taken from it yearly will reduce it and commute. Yeah. So if it was only taken one time, then it wouldn't diminish it. So that's indirect proof again, right? 53. Discuss how any claim which contradicts the understanding and practice of the Sahaba and generations of Muslim scholarship until today should be treated. Any claim, no matter how great the scholar or whatever, which contradicts the understanding and practice of the Sahaba and the generations of Muslim scholarship until today, should be treated as thrown against the wall. It's deviant. It's an error. Not acceptable. It may be considered an error of a scholar, which is overlooked, means you don't reject the man along with it. But if it is the error of an ignorant who's claiming for himself scholarship and misguiding people with it, then it is not overlooked. It is looked at as a serious error and deviance and heresy. And such a person has to be identified and pointed out to the masses to protect them. What is PJ's response to the opinion of the Sahaba on the matter of the Chennai Treatise? And how should we deal with such a response? What is his response? The Sahaba said, Umar ibn Khattab said, all these people said. What was his response to that? His response is, they're Rijal, men there who made mistakes, had their opinions, and so am I. I'm equal to them. Just because they said it doesn't make it right. They make mistakes, they're human beings. So they had an opinion, I have an opinion. My opinion, in fact, turns out to be right. So that's very serious. How do you deal with such an opinion? Somebody who says that. Huh?
You can say too many things.
But say one thing. No.
No, their mistakes also did not. It wasn't big mistakes like this that would change the whole
No.
step.
No, but this is not a response. Huh? Yeah.
Knocking down everybody.
Yeah. The point is that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ blessed them and said they were the best. So they're not equal. You are not equal to them. Yes, they were human beings who made mistakes, like you make mistakes. But collectively, they're better than you. So their collective understanding is better than your individual understanding. Now, 55 we covered earlier, so that really covers our review. Inshallah. So,
you mentioned about Imam Abu Hanifa, who thought that Iman was either it increased or it decreased.
no. His position was Iman does not increase or decrease. Yeah.
Sorry. Did he not know the hadith of Hanzala when Hanzala went to Rasulullah and he said Hanzala is a munafiq? And the Prophet explained to him, contrary to that, and said that if your Iman had stayed high, the Malaika would have come and shook hands with you. Why did he not take that position?
Okay, but this question, did Abu Hanifa not know the hadith of Hanzala and others which indicate a decrease and increase, right? One would have to say he probably did know, but he interpreted it in a different way. You see? Or he considered those hadith as not being mashhur. They were not well known. They may be authentic as in the narration of itself, but not well known enough to now establish a point of aqidah. So, taking that position in an area where there was hadith fabrication going on, and sects were evolving, arising, that was his position.
But that led to a great division in the Ummah because of that position. His students afterwards
No, that position, we can't say that position led to the split and the not allowance of marriage between schools. We can say that their blind following led to it. But we can't say his ruling led to, because that was not what he concluded. He never made that ruling about you can't, nor that you can't say inshallah. He never made that ruling. This was just his opinion that faith, didn't decrease or increase. Either you have faith or you don't have faith. And he had evidences to support this, So the state of having or not having, the Prophet ﷺ had said, for example, when a person, commits a sin, right? He's in the act of committing the sin, his faith leaves him and hovers over him. And when he repents, it comes back. So what is that saying? Yeah, yes. His faith has left him. So, you understand what I'm saying? It's not to say he had no evidence. He just ignored these hadith and he had nothing to support his position. No. Being a scholar of the, of the Ummah, leading scholars, he had hadith which also supported his opinion. And what did the other scholars do with those hadiths? Right? So they looked at this one and they looked at this one and they concluded that when it said that faith left him, it didn't mean faith in the absolute sense. Right? Not in the absolute sense. But that his faith became so weak at that point, it is as if it had left him altogether. You understand? Okay. So, further question? No. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك